There are things that should be impossible. Patterns so obvious, so undeniable that the only explanation for their continuation is that someone chose to look away. My name is Robert. I am a retired investigative journalist. In 2019, I spent 11 months in a town called Harlow Creek, population 2,400, located in rural Montana, 3 hours from the nearest city, one main street, one diner, one church, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone's name, and, it turned out, everyone's silence. What I found in Harlow Creek was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. No secret organization. No shadowy figure pulling strings. What I found was something far more disturbing. A community that had decided, collectively, quietly, completely, that some things were better left undisturbed. This is what happens when an entire town chooses silence over truth, and what it costs the people that silence swallows. I arrived in Harlow Creek in March 2019. I was not there for the disappearances. I was there to write a piece about rural community decline, a story about small towns losing their young people to cities and economic pressure. Standard feature journalism. On my third day, I was in the Harlow Creek Public Library going through archived local newspapers from the past 4 decades, and I saw it. Not immediately. It took me 40 minutes of reading before something made me stop. A disappearance notice. October 1989. A man named Carl Webb, age 34. Last seen October 13th. I noted it, turned the page. 3 years later in the archive, another notice. October 1992. A woman named Shirley Oates, age 28. Last seen October 13th. I put down the newspaper. I went back. I pulled every October edition from 1988 to 2018. 30 years of archives, spread across a library table in a town of 2,400 people. I found 23 disappearance notices. 23. All in October, all within 2 days of the 13th. My hands were not steady when I started making notes. I spent the next 3 weeks trying to talk to people. Carefully, casually, the way you do when you don't want to show your hand too early. I mentioned the disappearances to the owner of the diner, a woman named Patsy who had lived in Harlow Creek her entire life. She refilled my coffee, said, "People move away, it's a small town." Changed the subject. I mentioned it to the librarian. She smiled politely, said, "Old records aren't always accurate." Went back to her desk. I mentioned it to the sheriff, a man named Dale Hutchins, third-generation Harlow Creek, whose father and grandfather had both held the same position. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Robert, people go missing everywhere. You'd find patterns in any town if you looked hard enough. I'd be careful about what kind of story you think you're writing." It was not a threat. It was something quieter than a threat. A warning, the kind that comes from someone who knows exactly what you've found, and exactly what it means for you to keep looking. I kept looking. 6 weeks into my stay, a woman knocked on the door of the room I was renting above the hardware store. Her name was Helen Marsh. She was 73 years old. She had lived in Harlow Creek since 1971. She sat down at my small table. She looked at my notes, spread across every surface. She said, "You found the pattern." I said, "Yes." She said, "Then you need to understand what you're looking at before you write a single word." And for the next 2 hours, Helen Marsh told me everything. The disappearances had begun, she said, in October 1988. The first was a man named Victor Crane. Victor had been, by all accounts, a dangerous man. He had harmed people in the town, specific people, over many years, in ways the law, in a town this small with a sheriff this connected, had never adequately addressed. In October 1988, Victor Crane went missing. No investigation, no search party, no newspaper notice until months later. The town simply exhaled. Helen said she did not know what had happened to Victor Crane. She said she suspected. She said most people in Harlow Creek suspected. And then, she said, the following October, another person went missing. Someone else the town had reason to want gone. And the October after that, another. Over 30 years. The pattern had continued. Not every year, but most years. Always in October. Always around the 13th. Always someone, Helen chose her words carefully here, whose absence the town found easier to bear than their presence. I asked Helen the question I'd been building toward for 2 hours. Who? She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "That's not a question I can answer. Not because I'm protecting anyone. Because I genuinely don't know. And I think that's deliberate. I think whoever has been doing this for 30 years has been very careful to make sure that no single person in this town knows enough to tell the whole story. We each know a piece, a name, a date, a rumor, but never enough to act on. That's not an accident." I asked her why she was telling me this. She said, "Because I am 73 years old, and 3 of the people who disappeared did not deserve to. They were not dangerous people. They were inconvenient people. And somewhere along the way, the line moved. And nobody said anything, because nobody ever said anything. And I am too old to die having never said anything." I filed my story in January 2020. It ran in a national publication. Within 2 weeks, the FBI opened an investigation into disappearances in Harlow Creek, Montana. Dale Hutchins, the sheriff, retired abruptly 3 days after the story published. He has not spoken publicly since. The investigation is, to my knowledge, still ongoing. They have confirmed 11 of the disappearances as likely homicides. 3 arrests have been made, not of a single perpetrator, but of 3 separate individuals, apparently unconnected, who had each, in their own year, for their own reasons, decided that October 13th was the right moment to remove someone they believed the town would not miss. A pattern with no architect, a tradition with no founder, just a community that had learned over 30 years that silence worked. That absence went unquestioned. That October 13th was a date when Harlow Creek looked the other way. And people, dangerous people, yes, but then inconvenient people, and then simply people, learned to disappear. Helen Marsh died in April 2021, 14 months after she knocked on my door above the hardware store. I went to her funeral. It was a small service. Harlow Creek is a small town. Several people thanked me for the story. Several did not look at me at all. I think about Helen often, about what it costs a person to carry knowledge for decades, to live inside a silence you didn't choose but didn't break, and then, at 73, to finally knock on a stranger's door and say, "You've found the pattern. Now understand it." I think about the 3 people who did not deserve to disappear, whose names I know, whose families I have spoken to, who are still waiting for the investigation to give them something they can hold. And I think about October 13th, which will come again this year, as it always does, And I think about Harlow Creek, smaller now, quieter now, watched now, and I genuinely hope, that this year the date passes like any other. Just an autumn day. In a small town in Montana, where nothing happens, where nothing has to happen anymore. If something in this stayed with you, leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you are carrying something you have never told anyone, you are in the right place. I'll see you in the next one.